Hello, can everyone hear me? Be great. Thank you very much for joining this BERA Presidential Roundtable on the role of language development and social mobility. I'd like to welcome all the speakers and all our guests and to say how privileged we are to have such a distinguished panel of speakers, but also such a distinguished list of guests. And I can see that many people are local from England or around the UK, but we also have guests from Hong Kong, Norway, Australia, Singapore, and Malaysia. Well done for staying up so late for this. We hope it'll be worth it. I'd also like to thank BERA, the British Educational Research Association, for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to talk about such an important topic to social mobility, that of early language development and early literacy development. I'd like to thank in particular Professor Dominic Wise, who is the president of BERA and who extended this invitation to us. So welcome to everyone. What I'm going to do is introduce all the speakers. If we can put up my PowerPoint and take you through if I can do the next slide, where we have the program for the afternoon. The next slide. Okay. I thought that I would just take us through the program and introduce the speakers. And there'll be a few minutes between each speaker, just a few seconds while we take control of our own slides. I'm Iram Siraj from the University of Oxford. I'm Professor of Child Development and Education. And I'm going to be talking really about some English and UK research, which looks at the long-term effects of early language learning or lack of. And I'm going to draw particularly on the epilepsy study because I think it has told us a lot and impacted policy quite deeply. I'm then going to hand over to my colleagues, Dr. Sandra Mathers. I'll just say now, even though we have sent out the paper, which has the impact of long-term effects, looks at language development research, looks at policy, looks at practice. None of our speakers is simply a researcher or a policy wonk or a practitioner. We tend to have different proportions of those things in our background experience. For example, all of us have been and are teachers, which I think is quite rare in a group of academics. So our next speaker after me will be Dr. Sandra Mathers, who's an experienced teacher, researcher, and academic. She has a strong background in designing, delivering, and evaluating innovative evidence-based professional development aimed at improving language and educational equality. Like me, she's contributed to a number of longitudinal studies on child development, workforce, and language-based interventions. She's a member of the new Children of the 2020s study team. You have our bios, so I won't go into too much detail. Our speaker after Sandra is Jean Gross, and Jean has exceptional leadership experience across school, local authorities, and national initiatives, from chairing the Burkow 10 Years on Review to once being England's communication champion for children, which many of you will remember. But she really gets practice and contributes to the systematic application of evidence-based approaches to tackling disadvantage through her current and past consultancy and her many books and publications. And the one you should look out for is her forthcoming book, Reaching the Unseen Children, which I'm really tempted by the title. And our last but not least, certainly, speaker is Cassie Buchanan. Cassie is head teacher of Charles Dickens Primary School. This is a lead DFE teaching school hub and is also an EEF research school, amongst other things. She really does lead practice through evidence-based provision and is achieving outstanding Ofsted ratings consistently over many, many years. Her school practices evidence excellence and contributes immensely to the social mobility of her children and families in Southwark. And actually, Cassie, I've noticed it also contributes some social mobility to your teachers. You seem to be able to harness great professional development. So we're going to move on to my talk first. So I really wanted to look at the EPI and EPSI programme. There are many, many researches we could have focused on, and some of you will have read the researches I've referred to in our joint paper in the first part of that paper. But I wanted to draw attention to the effective provision of preschool education and the effective preschool primary and secondary education programme of research, because it's one of the most extensive longitudinal studies that has picked up on both the risk and protective factors to children through their learning life course. And this programme of study basically set out to look at what preschool, primary and secondary contributed to the learning life course of schooling. And then also to collect information on child and family and home learning, to look at how these articulated with each other to produce poor or outstanding or normal outcomes. The research also, and this is the bits I'm going to focus on today because there's a great deal in this study, looks at the factors that influence the equity gap in educational outcomes. So I'm really concerned here about social mobility in terms of educational outcomes. And in particular, I'll focus on how language experiences impact on later life chances. And this is both oral and early literacy in particular. And I will just say that in terms of the polls, thank you very much for filling them in. The answer to the second question was about the months of disadvantage was 16 months. The answers to the third question, there are no right answers in a sense, because they change as the influence impacts as the children get older. And I think there are many people that have picked up on some aspects of the social mobility gap, but you might be surprised by one or two of the ones that have come at the bottom. And we'll go through them. I'll talk about them in the slides where it really begins to matter, and you'll see how they change over the learning life course. The sources of data for EPSI are quite profound. So this has, my colleagues Ted Mellish, Kathy Silver, Pam Salmons, Brenda Taggart, we collected data with our team of researchers over 7 or 8 times during the children's learning life course. And the learning trajectories across childhood and how attainment levels at one stage influence subsequent achievement is of immense policy and research interest, and it's strongly linked to social and educational mobility for children. Some of our research where we followed the children to A-levels and then university, we can't talk about today, but I want to touch on some things. There are 2 projects in particular in EPSI that have looked at this in different ways. The quantitative analysis to identify and explain different trajectories. And here I'm just going to focus on language and not maths and science, and how they relate to background characteristics. What I'm not going to talk about today are the qualitative analyses, drawing on 50 carefully selected case studies of individuals from different trajectories of interest, particularly those kids who were succeeding against the odds. But I'm discussing this during my keynote for BERA. So what were the trajectories? This is some unpublished work that Ted Mellish led on, the trajectories of attainment relative to expectation In literacy, we looked at the children's starting points and then how they progressed through school to the end of compulsory schooling in terms of their initial points of assessment and then through primary and secondary. And here we have the preliminary preschool group trajectories for language and literacy, and mostly early literacy, because that's what you can see, even at the age of 3, children have different starting points. As we said in the previous slide, for instance, if you take the first 3, initially very low and declining, initially low but improving, initially low as expected but declining. So going to this, you can see the trajectory 1 is where children started off very low and continued to get worse. Trajectory 2 is where they started off, 3 is where they started off relatively low and make progress as expected. And trajectory 2 is the most interesting, where they started off low, but actually succeed against the odds and get up to a relatively high level. And then you've got the same the other way around, where some groups start higher and go lower. But what's interesting about this graph, to me, is if you look at the age between 3 and the end of key stage 1, 3 to 7, and particularly 3 to 6, most of the change is happening during that period. It's not happening so much from here to the end of the preschool period. That means the trajectories are relatively set. That doesn't mean that individual children can't make differences, but most of the movement is happening in the early years, which is why I think language development in preschool and the first years of primary school becomes a very, very important and significant time for children. So what's differentiating improving high group from declining low group? What are the risk and protective factors that we can look at and actually do something about? So for instance, something like poverty for children, we in education can't do too much about that. We can vote, we can campaign, but something like high quality preschool is something we can do something about. So the analyses suggested that the following 3 components have protective and risk factors. So if the early years home environment, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, if that's low compared to medium, compared to high, can impact on a child's language development and hence their life chances. And similarly for preschool effectiveness and quality. You'll see later on that we will show that there is a link between preschool quality and early literacy, but not so much a strong link between preschool quality and oracy, and also primary school effectiveness. And by effectiveness, we mean the impact, the change in outcomes from when a child comes in to when a child leaves preschool or primary school. So the family is very important, and hence we've had a lot of home learning environment initiatives in this country and abroad, but so do family practices. And in particular, social class and mother's qualification levels tend to impact on decoding and vocabulary, which we all know are central to early literacy and later literacy development. But what parents do matters as well. And this is what the home learning environment we measured before the age of 5. I'm only going to show the home learning environments, the HLEs at 5, and well, actually, these were measured when the children were 3, 4, when they came into preschool. And these were the elements that were linked, most of them, to children's language development, being read to every day, more often painting, drawing, going to the library, playing with letters and numbers. And you can see the distribution of this HLE for children. At the bottom here, you can see it's a normal distribution, which is quite distressing because we'd like it to be skewed in this direction, where many children have a very low home learning environment and others have a very high one, with most of the children being somewhere in between. And what's interesting for me is that, you know, there's the expected moderate positive association between HLE and social class. But then we did see the parents who had low SES and qualifications, but still provided a high home learning environment. And another surprising finding was that girls were twice as likely to have the higher home learning environment than boys. And again, as we've said, decoding phonological awareness, children's awareness of rhyme and alliteration, and letter recognition and vocabulary were critically important to language and emergent literacy. We also found that pre-reading was influenced by the amount of time a child went to preschool and the quality. So we looked at duration and quality, and the blue here is the duration and the red is the quality, and both matter. So, as I said, quality seems to have an impact, especially from the ECAZ, the Early Childhood Environment Rating extension, where we were able to compare that to children's the quality of the centre and whether it impacted on phonological awareness and letter recognition. And it did. And for those of you that don't know how these scales measure quality, you can see just by looking at that as you go through to rate a centre for minimal, good or excellent, you can see that there is more intentional pedagogy and more procedural, declarative and conceptual knowledge by the teacher of what to do in terms of sounds in words. We then measured the home learning environment also at the age of 6, and you can see that we looked mainly at home computing, enrichment activities, but in red are the two that had the biggest impact on language. And these were structured interactions at home, one-to-one, and expressive play. And in the paper we sent you, I would like to add a section on play and language development. We didn't get sufficient time to do that, but it will have a section on that because I think both free play, guided play, role play have an important impact. What's interesting again is that we have a gender difference. We have here in terms of computing in the home, many boys spending more time on computing, far less on expressive play. Although we've got similar amounts of time for boys and girls on enrichment and interaction, girls are far more engaged in expressive play, and we found a higher association between expressive play and language development. So this is where you'll find some of the answers to the third question on child family, HLE, and you know, what impacted. We have the effect sizes here, and you can see that older children had better language scores than younger ones. Gender had an impact, but look at the impact of birth weight. Very low birth weight children have a more difficult start to their language development. They begin to catch up a bit, but you'll be very interested. That was put as 8 in your poll, and yet it has a big impact. It tells us something about, you know, like the Marmot review, about collecting health information and developmental information in early record keeping as well. As you'd expect, parents' education and social class, but look at the effect of the early home learning environment too, and preschool. And I'll have to move through these quite quickly. I'm sorry about that, but I'm almost out of time. I'll just take one more minute to say that you can see that although birth weight goes down considerably at 11, it certainly doesn't go down completely. So some children begin to catch up. Gender's still important. Ethnicity, not as important, but children who continue to need English as an additional language support at 11 are again, is relatively high. And the other patterns as you would expect, but you can still see preschool quality effect, effectiveness effect, and home learning environment. And last two slides, English at age 14, and you can see there is still a birth weight effect. Gender becomes bigger here, and so on. And we still have HLE, early years HLE having an impact, and the home learning environment at the age of 6, but also mother's qualification, which some of you put very high, has an impact. So basically, some take-home messages. Home activities for decoding are different from support for oral language. Sandra is going to talk a lot more and take us through the research on both of these, but in particular oral language as well. And one of the most striking findings is the contribution of one-to-one parent-child interactions to the major outcomes, and home influences being stronger for language than maths and science. And a very strong protective factor, pedagogical quality of two kinds in the preschool: support for emerging academic skills and support for social development. And, you know, we've got some findings that teaching quality is very important in the early years, but in secondary, it only fits of the highest quality. So there's probably an awful lot to unpick in there and to take in, but we're going to move on to Sandra's talk now about the evidence on supporting language development, some highlights from the paper that some of you have had a chance to read.
Okay, so I'm going to highlight some of the research evidence on how to support oral language development. So I won't go into detail, but just give a flavour of some of the topics that we cover in our paper. So research tells us that the most language supporting adult-child interactions are those which are interactive and responsive, which provide linguistic input which is adapted to the child's own language, and which are conceptually challenging for the child. So these are the kinds of interactions which support effective language learning in early childhood, both at home and in early education. Now, as Iram has said, children from disadvantaged homes tend to experience fewer of these interactions on average. So if we're going to provide these children with a really rich language environment in preschool to help nurture their development, then how do we do that? How do we improve the quality of our oral language provision? So there are 3 broad types of evidence-based approach that we might take. So, for example, curriculum-based approaches, which give us a program to follow, professional development, which targets workforce knowledge and skills, and then a range of other approaches that I've collected together here under other interventions. So in here we might have, for example, speech and language therapy for individuals or for groups of children. So when choosing interventions to invest in, schools and settings have got some quite difficult decisions to make. So obviously approaches should be evidence-based, but for example, should we use approaches which are targeted or which are universal for all children? So targeted approaches focus resources on the children most in need, but I would argue that we also badly need interventions which are universal. So particularly with the after effects of the pandemic, when so many children need support with their oral language. And then another key choice is whether to invest in packaged and prescriptive interventions to improve our language supporting interactions, or in broader professional development type approaches. So there are pros and cons of each of these. You can see these summarised here for prescriptive programmes at the top and then more adaptive approaches at the bottom. Now, a good example of an evidence-based scripted programme is the Nuffield Early Language Intervention. So that's currently making a difference for thousands of children across the UK. Because there's a script to follow, it's quite easy for a wide range of staff to deliver the programme with fidelity. So we can be sure that children are receiving the support as intended, if you like. And the programme's not lost when staff move on, because new staff can easily take over delivery. On the downside, they're less tailored to individual needs and contexts, And crucially, they don't build longer term workforce capacity. Now, a professional development programme, on the other hand, is less prescriptive, but it's more complicated to implement. And the intervention as experienced by children will be different in every setting. New knowledge and skills also move on when staff leave, although of course they take their learning with them wherever they go next. But professional development ultimately does more to build the long-term capacity of the workforce. And by its nature, it's more adaptable to the individual needs of schools and children. Now, we're increasingly moving towards quite scripted programmes, partly because I think they're easier to evidence and they seem a safer bet, but I worry that they're deprofessionalising. And I wanted to share with you some research which shows that we ultimately need to move beyond that script. So this study tested the implementation of the LEAP oral language programme. That uses small group play-based type activities to target 23 language and literacy learning objectives. Now, one group of teachers in the study were given scripted lesson plans, so softly scripted. And the second were asked to target the same learning objectives, but using their own plans, so no script, and then given support in how to do that. Now, although children's literacy skills improved in both groups, only children in the unscripted group made gains in oral language. Now, the authors suggest that this might be because unscripted programs allow for more responsive interactions, which are adapted to the language and the needs and the interests of the children. So we might not achieve what we need by using scripted programs alone, and supporting educators to use their professional knowledge has the potential for greater impact on oral language. But to take that route, we really need to invest in the knowledge and skills of the workforce. This study took place in Denmark, where all early educators are very highly qualified. Personally, I think there's great promise in flexible intervention programs like this, with embedded professional development to develop pedagogical knowledge and skills. And I'm working with Julie Dockrell at the moment on a program called Talking Time, which follows these principles. I recently did some work in a separate study, which shows the importance of pedagogical knowledge. Now, I need to apologise here, these two slides are a bit wordy, but I wanted you to have the detail for later, so hopefully you'll forgive me. In this study, we measured teachers' knowledge by asking them to watch videos of preschool interactions, and then to identify the strategies being used by the adult, which would support oral language. Now, this is basically measuring knowledge in context, the kind of dynamic knowledge which supports in the moment decision-making in the classroom. And then we also had measures of the quality of language supporting practice in these teachers' classrooms. Now, teachers could identify a really wide range of strategies in the videos, which was great. But simply knowing, so being able to recognise these strategies wasn't enough. That the teachers with that most language supporting classrooms were those who had more formal and explicit knowledge of language strategies, so could name them using professional vocabulary, for example. And also the teachers who could analyse how and why those strategies might be used. So, for example, rather than just saying she's describing the child's actions, someone might have said she's using descriptive commentary to build the child's vocabulary in context. So identifying the same strategy, but using a specialist term, descriptive commentary, and linking it to possible child outcomes, building vocabulary in context. So knowing why that strategy is useful. So what matters most for quality is specialist knowledge of oral language pedagogy and also classroom reasoning. So knowing how and why strategies might be used, essentially linking knowledge of practice to knowledge on child development. So, for example, I'm doing this because, or this child needs X, so I will do Y. This is the kind of knowledge that supports the intentional practice that Irene was mentioning earlier, adapting your practice in the moment with a specific language learning aim in mind. So just having tacit knowledge, knowing by doing without knowing why, isn't enough. So how do we develop this specialist knowledge then of oral language pedagogy? Well, We tested this in the same study and found that it did not develop naturally through experience. Just having more years in the classroom did not mean necessarily better knowledge of oral language pedagogy. But taking part in the early professional development programme did lead to greater knowledge. And that knowledge mediated improvements in classroom quality. So professional development led to better knowledge, which led to better practice. So we're back to the importance of professional development. And to build a workforce which can really support oral language development in the long term, educators need opportunities to gain specialist knowledge of language development and pedagogy, but knowledge which is also embedded in the classroom context. So just having theoretical knowledge is no good. That theory has to become live and dynamic knowledge and be accessible in the moment to use. So how do we develop that kind of knowledge? Well, we can do that through professional development, which develops knowledge and skills, but also supports transfer to practice. So instructional coaching is getting good results, for example. Through deliberate rehearsal and reflection on our language practice in the classroom, noticing, rehearsing, analysing, through pedagogical conversations among staff teams, so discussing concepts, using professional terms, practicing that pedagogical reasoning. I'm doing this because this child needs X, so I will do Y. And as I said before, through adaptive early language interventions with embedded professional development. Okay, so almost there. Just in last couple of minutes, before I hand over to Jean, we've talked a bit about how to develop our language supporting practice in the classroom. I just wanted to really briefly touch on one area where we might have an impact in the home by thinking about children's use of technology. Now, I think this is a really important area because apps and ebooks and other media, they're so much part of children's everyday lives, even more so in disadvantaged homes. And we know that high rates of media use are associated with poorer early language growth. So what's the evidence? Well, we know that well-designed ebooks can actually be more beneficial than paper books for oral language. For example, when they have print, which is highlighted as the story's read, or enhancements which build on the story. There are a lot of ebooks which are not so well designed. We also know that ebooks are less beneficial than paper books for low SES children, so for disadvantaged children, and also for school-based shared reading. So the benefits depend on the design of the ebook and on the context in which they're used. There's also evidence that children can benefit from using educational apps, but the effects here have been found mainly for quite constrained or narrow literacy skills like phonological awareness or letter recognition. There's actually very little evidence that apps benefit broader aspects of oral language like vocabulary or reading comprehension. And that makes sense, right? We know that children learn language best when they use language through responsive conversations with adults. So, surprise, surprise, we're back to the importance of adult-child interaction. While children can learn from apps and ebooks when they use them alone, gains for oral language will be much greater when they engage with an adult. So supporting parents to use media with their children is an area where I think we can really make a difference for oral language. So we know that almost a third of children under 5 usually use apps alone. Very few apps offer explicit encouragement or guidance for parents on co-use. And we know that parent-child interactions with digital media tend to be less language supporting than with traditional media like books or physical games. So there are some really practical implications here for practice, and many parents would benefit from understanding how to support or from help in understanding how to support their children through technology. I think that schools and settings, local authorities, policymakers, they've all got a really key role to play in communicating to parents the importance of co-using apps and ebooks and giving ideas on how that might be done. Okay, that was a whiz through the research evidence on supporting language development. That's the end of my little section. You'll hear from Jean in just a moment, but maybe just take 30 seconds or so for reflection now while we get the next slides up and working. And then I'll see you again at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jean. Sandra, that was so interesting. And Iram, I'm longing to start a discussion. I know everybody out there will be wanting to contribute ideas, and I just hope we'll get to that bit soon. I'm going to talk about the policy context across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, starting with England. What is happening in the devolved nations in England about addressing the data that shows that link between, I think, not poverty, it's, as you know, it's as Kathy Silver says, it's what you do, not what you earn, that counts, or who you are. It's not the money, it's the how you know how to promote those interactions. And let's look at what different governments are doing to address that gap. Well, politicians do like simple messages, and the idea that the word gap caught their imagination. The word gap comes originally, as I'm sure all of you will know, from some rather old research by Hart and Risley that counted the number of words addressed to children in the home in the preschool years and found a big gap called the 30 million word gap in the number of words children heard according to the levels of disadvantage of the families they were brought up in. Now, it's rather old, but there is much newer research, and many of us had an opportunity to present some of that research, for example, through the Berco 10 Years On review, present that research to civil servants who then feed it in to ministers. And in an example of actually following the science, government have followed the science, and in England, they included it, early language, not just literacy, but early language, in their social mobility strategy in 2017. Justine Greening was the first Secretary of State for Education to make that a key plank at the top of her to-do list. Then later, Damien Hines showed a great enthusiasm for this issue and actually made an aspiration, not sure whether it's an aspiration or a commitment, that by 2028 we would see a halving in the numbers of children not reaching the age of 5 without the communication and language skills they need. Whether that, and the current Secretary of State, presumably that commitment, that aspiration still remains, but whether it ever gets measured in 2028, I'll be looking at that too with interest to see whether it happens. There is a long way to go. Last year, the Early Intervention Foundation did their own analysis of some of the national data, and they found that there'd been very little closing of the disadvantage gap in communication and language in recent years. They also interestingly found some substantial regional variations, with the East Midlands and the South West having the largest gap between children who are brought up in poverty and those who are not, specifically on communication and language, not literacy, but this was communication and language. Not surprisingly, this data showed that there was a bigger gender gap between the communication and language achievement of boys and girls in the group who were brought up in poverty. And that was driven by the low achievement of boys brought up in poverty. And we've heard more from previous speakers about the particular issues in the home learning environment, all sorts of other factors affecting boys. So what is the English government doing? This is a summary of their social mobility plan actions in the last couple of years. I'm not going to talk through all of them. If any of you want to pick up any in questions afterwards, please do. I just want to focus on three, on the Nuffield Early Language Intervention first, which Sandra has mentioned in policy terms. As part of its COVID catch-up funding, recovery funding, government has made funding available to any primary school in England who wants it to part fund this programme, which is a mixture of small group and one-to-one activities going over 20 weeks in reception classes for children aged 4 to 5. It is highly evidence-based. Interestingly, it is delivered by teaching assistants and it is a scripted programme, and we might discuss earlier the differences between teachers and teaching assistants when you come to the amount of scripting that works. The issue with Nellie there's been very high take up. The issue will be the extent to which schools use it with fidelity, particularly at this time, like this term. I've heard this morning that many schools had, committed to, gone on the training, got the kit, but whether they're able to deliver it under the current stresses and even into next year, we'll have to see whether fidelity, and whether it's the usual issue when you scale up something and you scale it up more and more, often it isn't as effective. I'm really hoping this will be, but there are real delivery issues for schools in this. And then funded voluntary sector initiatives. Wanted to give you just one example. Government put a lot of money into the voluntary sector for kind of projects and initiatives. And I'm going to tell you about one because I think it's relevant to the interface between research and practice. And it was funded and it's developed by the children's communication charity ICANN. It's called Tots Talking, and it's a program targeted based on research in the sense that it's targeted at the home learning environment. It's targeted at improving the contingent interactions between parents and children. It is targeted young. It's targeted at parents of 2-year-olds, because of the research evidence that shows the earlier we can support those interactions, the better, but also in policy terms, because the age of 2 is now in England an age when health visitors are using new tools to pick up children who may be struggling, where there's a whole lot of training and focus on the 2-year-olds. And so that's a time when children may be identified, and therefore one might be able to target this programme, not at everybody, but at those who are struggling. But what I want to bring out about this is the fact that it was co-produced with families. Now, you can devise the best intervention in the world, but you can't ensure that a parent in a really, really tough area of Knowsley, in Liverpool, a teenage parent who's been in care or whatever, what will make them come? How will you get take up? And that's sometimes more of an issue than the actual programme. So this programme was co-produced with parents just like that. They came together to give their advice about what they thought would work. So, for example, they were shown different film clips, and they really liked film clips that were about the child's developing brain. So they said, we want that to be in this programme. They liked stuff on the brain. They liked the research about the number of words children hear. So they said that should be included. Another message was the challenges that parents face in doing something differently. Many of the parents who were involved in this said that they felt judged by their peer group if they were seen talking to or reading to their children. The message in the community was, well, why would you want to talk to children who aren't talking much themselves? It's too soon, isn't it? And they felt silly. I can't tell you how many parents have told me that. I feel stupid if I'm sitting on a bus talking to my child who's not talking back. So we have to get into the mind of families if we want to influence him in changing their behaviour. So the other co-production, parents use the sort of strictly type voting on what they thought should be in or out of the programme, and the final design begins with a personal element. How was your week? And then we're thinking about this today, then some films to watch and maybe spot the difference, look at what the mum or dad's doing in this film and what difference does it make to the way what in the other film, and then something practical to make, something that the parents can make and take home to use with their children to interact, and something to try at home. So I bring that out to say that research has to include how to change behaviour as well as what the behaviour is we want to change. The last one is the parent-facing campaign, which has been a major investment for the Department for Education in England. And the campaign's been called Hungry Little Minds. It was developed again with lots of advice in this case, from marketing agencies, did focus group with parents, with target parents from disadvantaged areas, who also like the idea of brains and children's minds soaking up new information. So that influenced the title, Hungry Little Minds. And what the other key message that parents says was, it has to not take much time. It has to fit into my every day. I haven't got time to do something special. It needs to be built into everyday activities. So here you see the kind of images, the collateral that were developed, which were put on a website, and then also they were shared by social media and carefully chosen print media. Government wanted the early years sector practitioners in settings to amplify this message. So they produced collateral that settings could download and personalize. And I particularly love this one. I hardly understood a word, but I'm so glad we had this chat. Government wanted business to be a partner in this. And so they enlisted businesses to see what they could do about early language. And this is a lovely example from Arriva, the transport company. Now, some time back, they'd showed an interest in speech language communication, and they developed at half term the noisy carriage on their trains. Instead of the quiet carriage, they'd have the noisy carriage to encourage people to talk to their families. And then this was more recent. They put pictures with things to talk about, prompts for discussion on the roof of their buses, on their look-up buses. Let's go on now from England to the other nations. And in Wales, the flagship programme there, Flying Start, has been in place for years and years. It's targeted at the most particular postcodes, children from conception to age 3, and there's a range of different opportunities, including speech and language programmes. And the government draws on evidence. They have published and are now revising a list of evidence-based training and programmes for speech, language and communication. The Welsh Government are also now developing their own campaign, Talk With Me. They have a plan to have a public-facing campaign to reach parents, to develop training for practitioners, and to introduce also, like England, a potential new measure to pick up children early on who may be struggling with their language. In Scotland, there's been a drive to upskill health visitors. And in Northern Ireland, it's very interesting that a lot of the work many of people will remember in England came from the Sure Start local programmes, the Labour government's Sure Start. And although the children's centres, the Sure Start children's centres in many cases survive across the country, there are fewer of them. Northern Ireland has a continued commitment to Sure Start, and you will find speech language communication in all 38 local programmes. Now, just as important as what happens at national government is local government. And I could give you, I've written in my books various examples of fantastic local initiatives, but just to say a bit about that. Last year, the Early Intervention Foundation, I did some case studies for them, looking at areas, local authority areas in England in this case, who had made some progress in narrowing the gap in language, communication and language by the age of 5. So they'd made progress, hadn't necessarily closed it, but they were on an upward trajectory. And I looked at the themes that seemed to run across those areas that were having some success. So the first theme was about people working together, health visitors, speech language therapists, early years practitioners in settings, and others collaborating on initiatives. The opposite of what someone wisely recently called lanyard working, you know, when you follow your own initiatives, you tick your own boxes, you're not bothered about other people's boxes to tick, and you follow your lanyard. Well, the opposite of that, where everybody's committed locally to not overlap, but to integrate in relation to what they're doing for early language. The second theme was people using assessments well to spot needs and track children's progress in language. And all of these areas had done a lot to upskill practitioners in earlier settings to deliver things themselves, not just to say this child needs help, I will refer them to speech language therapy, but to say, what can I do? There may be some children who don't need that, some who do, but what can I do in my setting was a theme throughout. The third theme was all these areas had a high take-up of the government-funded childcare and education places for the most disadvantaged two-year-olds, and that provision was of high quality. And this is something really to focus on. I read last week some research showing that from Oxford Baby Lab saying that the impact of COVID on children's early language, they looked at children up to the age of 36 months, and the amount of time they were spending in preschool during the lockdowns influenced their language. They did better when they were in a setting than they were just at home. Now, I know that doesn't affect all families, but it was an overall finding, and it was particularly true for disadvantaged families. The next theme was about quality for 3 and 4 year olds, where again the quality of provision for 3 and 4 year olds was above average, as judged by Ofsted, more good or outstanding provision. And there were strong local authority teams. The local authority had kept expert advisory teachers who knew, say, about communication and language, who were out there upskilling practitioners and working with them and identifying settings where outcomes weren't good and targeting them for extra support. And then the last theme is that, again, as Sandra was talking about, a really skilled workforce. Some of you will remember an amazing government programme called Every Child a Talker. Well, I've found in the case studies a lot of the areas that were still doing well had taken apart, had kept on a lot of those strategies, and they had that legacy of people who'd taken part in training for Every Child a Talker, but also they were constantly introducing and refreshing new forms of effective professional development, the kind of professional development that's sustained, not just one-off courses, but things like coaching, having communication champions in earlier settings, people watching themselves on video and saying, oh, I didn't know I did that, and then changing their practice as a result. This is just one example of a local authority programme to give you a flavour. It was in North Tyneside, based on research. There is research, some of you will know, that shows that young children's vocabulary, they retain new vocabulary better if they hear that vocabulary repeated over and over again in the same book, rather than that vocabulary repeated the same number of times, but in different books. So it's about repeated reads to promote vocabulary. So this project used that idea, and they made sure that a small number of books was shared with children at least 5 times, and regular sessions. And I know places that, like the wonderful Sheringham Nursery, have a core books. Many schools use a core books scheme, or early years settings and nurseries. Core books share again and again. So my final thoughts are about linking research policy and practice. And I'm wondering really is, you can always go on learning, but we do know quite a lot now about how adults can best promote language development, the kind of interactions. But what's difficult is getting those to happen, both in parents, as I was talking earlier in relation to Tots Talking, and in practitioners who find it really difficult to make time to have conversations with children. They find it hard, that they report being stretched and busy, and they haven't got time for conversations. They can't put it in their planning. You can't record in your planning that you're going to have a conversation, and yet that's the most important thing you can do. And then there's the whole issue of the vocabulary levels of the adults themselves, and their complexity of the language, how far they are able to promote the language of others. So maybe we need to look at how we overcome those barriers, what kind of experience, what kind of training and insights will change those highly established ways of interacting with children. So that's all that, those are my books. The Reaching the Unseen Children is about white disadvantaged pupils, particularly boys, who early language is often the key factor that then sets them on a path of struggling at school, and they have the lowest results of any group, any major ethnic group in the system. So thank you very much. Look forward to discussion later.
Hi everyone. Well, I mean, amazing so far. I feel like I've got a very heavy crown to wear now, in terms of talking about how some of that is put into practice in a school and a nursery school. So I am going to focus on early years in nursery settings, and talk a little bit about how, hopefully, I was very reassured, quite how a lot of that research can be put into place practically in a mainstream nursery setting, so that could be maintained or independent. So if I tell you a little bit first of all about the school, we are based in central London in England. We are 500 pupils. We have a really large nursery, and we were lucky, thinking about what Jean said about developing nurseries for 2-year-olds, in that we were supported about 6 or 7 years ago with capital funding to open up a nursery for 2-year-olds. So we already had quite a large nursery for 3-year-olds, and because, as you can see, we're one of the most deprived postcodes in this area of London, and we were supported, based on the research, to open a high quality environment for 2-year-olds. So we have 24 2-year-olds at any one time and in nursery setting. And you can see there as well that half of those places are reserved for children who are in receipt of the early years pupil PME grant. And what that means is that their parents have been able to access out of work funding. So for those children, they get to come free. So funding for them isn't a barrier, and they come every single day. So if I tell you a little bit then about what we do, and I guess for me, hearing all of that different research is sort of, how do you assimilate all of that? How do you make it concrete, and which bits do you pull? And no surprise, we are an Education Endowment Foundation research school. So what we tend to do is to take all of the research that we see, and we look to see how is that represented in the EEF guidance reports and the Preparing for Literacy report, which I've little screenshot there, but you can download it. Pull some of these strands out into sort of easily digestible areas to look at, really. And today we're going to look at 3 of those. We're going to look at sort of preparing for communication language. So what have we done in our setting, and taking all of that research to bring all of that to life. And hopefully I can try and touch on some of the things that Sandra, Iram and Jean have said. Then we're going to look a little bit then at what are two particular needs that our community has. One of them is around self-regulation. So how do we give children the language to support them in terms of their interactions, their behaviour, and to stay sort of on task in things that are interesting for them as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about supporting children who come with either very little language or come with a social and communication barrier, such as autism. So if I think about the first one of these, I guess what was really fascinating, I'm trying to kind of draw it all together. We talked sort of about the needs across all of the previous speakers for kind of really thinking and planning for language teaching, and how do you do that in a busy nursery day? And also, how do you pull on all of these key reviews and think, and which are the strands that I'm going to take, I guess, which are you going to prioritise? So we have what we call a universal offer. And our universal offer is about this, really. So first of all, for our nursery for 2-year-olds, most of our children who come age 2, what we try and do is, because they come with very limited language, but also very limited life and often domestic experiences as well, is we've tried to build progression into our environment. So we start off with our 2-year-olds in the nursery, and our environment there is quite domestic. So we have lots of opportunities for children to engage in things that feel familiar for the home. So that isn't just a sort of home corner, but really about replicating things like cooking and planting, and a sort of environment with toys in it, and building and outside and garden, so that children, it isn't a huge shock coming to nursery. And then we have a very language rich environment. So it was really interesting hearing about computers and the role of technology, because in our nursery we have absolutely no technology at all. There is a screen which sort of came with the room, but it is very rarely switched on. So all of the language therefore has to come from the adults, the children themselves, and the things that they're interacting with. And then perhaps what's unusual, or maybe not, you can tell me later, about our nursery is from the age of 2. all the way up until they join us in the school, is that they have daily timetabled taught language groups. And they are not sort of little children sitting on chairs facing the front, but they are often led through play. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So in order to make time for taught language, we've tended to move away from adults sort of parachuting in and narrating what's happening to the children, and actually spending more time on the adults interacting with the children in a way that's built into our curriculum. Now, that's been quite hard as a move away from maybe some of the different and traditional ways that adults may have interacted with children. So again, it's sort of interesting hearing all of the research, because one of the things that we have done as a staff body is to really invest in staff professional development. And we've done, I guess, a few different things there. First of all, we've really looked at what the guidance report says, the evidence, and really understood that kind of first layer of what the best bets are for developing language. And then we've gone underneath that and we've gone back to look at what that the research in its raw form, I guess, and really tried to understand, well, how does the context in which that research was sort of happening or taking place, how does it reflect the environment in which we're working, so that our teachers and our teaching assistants, our early years educators, we tend to think of them all as being the same. Maybe that's a key. We've thought really about how we develop sort of academic debate amongst our early years staff. How do we give them the practical tools to be able to deliver really high quality language interactions, and what are the barriers to that? And interesting again to hear talk of scripted conversations. One of the barriers that fed back to us was that actually scripted conversations, whilst initially they feel quite exciting because you've kind of got something and you get up and go, they actually sort of can become a bit of a challenge over time and stop people thinking about the why as opposed to the how. So where we do run the Nelly program, so we do have the Nelly program, but in addition to that, because I think that on its own wouldn't be enough, we've invested quite a lot of time in getting people to understand the evidence base behind why they do the things they do. But also we have something called instructional coaching, which was referred to earlier, where each member of staff has a coach and is making small incremental marginal gains and reflecting on their practice on a weekly basis. And that's felt really important for people understanding the impacts of their work and being able to think about it in a low stakes way professionally. So that's sort of the background, I guess, behind our approach. And then just breaking down them. So what do we mean when we say sort of directed language teaching? So we do three things. And again, interesting to hear about the work of Sheringham, because we're on a very similar place, Sheringham Nursery being another research school in the EEF network. Our taught sessions could be one of three things. They could be shared reading experiences, and you can see the practitioner in there doing one of those shared sessions. And we have a group of core books, so books that are read over and over again. That's either the practitioner chooses or the child chooses, and they're not necessarily read in full, but they'll be read in part. We talk about the pictures, and they are a springboard to further language. We have shared play. You can see the practitioner on the right leading the play and developing children's language, either with objects. We use a lot of small world, or with heuristic play, particularly with our very, very young children. And then we also build in, this is all planned, build in time for what we call shared experiences. And they aren't kind of razzmatazz experiences, but they are often domestic experiences that the child does alongside the adult, and they talk about it. So which could include cooking. We have a garden where we do a lot of planting. We have chickens. We have all sorts of strange pets. So a lot of it is really about looking after and being engaged with the environment. So going to see, a hairdresser and how a hairdresser works, or going to buy things in a shop. And all of those experiences are talked about with the children as they're happening. So that's how we teach language explicitly, and that is our universal offer. And then we think about what are our two contexts, our two needs, that we have to do something that may be not appropriate or needing as much intensive focus as other settings. And the first of those is self-regulation. So our children often come and join us at needing quite a lot of support with managing their behaviour, whether they join us at 2, 4, 6 or indeed 10. So for this, we actually looked at the evidence base in this country and found it rather sort of lacking. So we went to the States and we have taken a programme from America, from Yale University, and I have put the link there if you're interested, from the Yale Centre of Emotion Intelligence. And the approach is called Ruler, and we were the first school in this country, it's very, very kind of big in the States, to use this evidence-based approach. It has a really, really strong research base behind it, including a longitudinal study. And what it does is it teaches children the language of behaviour and emotions. So it's really about understanding and regulating your emotions. And why that's important for young children and indeed sort of adults, I suppose, is that if you're able to talk about your behaviours, then more of your time is spent on language that's perhaps linked to understanding the world or book learning, because you aren't kind of, negotiating, holding on to something that somebody else has got, or feeling cross and because you didn't understand part of the day. So Ruler has become a key part of our language learning. We teach our emotions for Ruler sequentially. So the children in nursery all the way up to year 6 learn a set of emotions in order. We teach what it feels like for that child, and every child will be different to understand that emotion. And we teach children how to express that emotion. So it might be through language or through, it could be nonverbal, but for that we're sort of saying, well, that's the kind of starting point, and how do you express yourself verbally. But then the important point is that we teach children how to move from an unpleasant to a pleasant emotion, and how to navigate and articulate conflict. And that's tipped over into what we call the Wellbeing School, where we've created a whole curriculum to go with that. And really without that, all of that work that I've talked about in terms of direct teaching of book language or language to do with the world probably wouldn't stack up, because our children would still have to negotiate friendships and an understanding of a world that's very new when you're very small. So this work on Ruler has become really crucial to help children almost maximise the time for everything else and to feel happy and comfortable in the space. So that's Ruler, and it's from the States, and a lot of their work is open source. So if you are really interested, it's all kind of there, all of their resources, their training and everything else. And then the other thing that's really important for us, and may be important for you as well, is how do we support children who come with very little language to our school, and those children who come who are autistic or who have social and communication barriers. And for this, we really felt like we needed to do our own research and to draw upon what was out there. So our starting point for our children, and I have to say that we've probably got in Southwark, I don't know how it is where you are, but we have an above average number of children in Southwark with autism, and it's on the rise, which is sort of new for us, and it's something that now is predictable, so we have to make sure that we are adapting to it. So as a group of schools led by Charles Dickens Research School, we drew upon what was there. So we took two documents. We took the UCL document about making autism practice work and really supporting groups of schools to do their own research. And then we also looked at, and this is the booklet that we sort of made in the end, and then we also looked at the all parliamentary group on autism as well. And from that, our groups of schools went away and did their own action research on what would work for their school. And we came up with these key themes that are actually really important for language learning generally, was the feedback from all of the nurseries and schools that got involved. The first one being the enabling environment. We've talked a little bit about environment today, but interestingly, it came back as a really major theme, particularly in nurseries where there were 1 and 2 year olds. And that idea of the environment being overstimulating, distracting, and therefore quite distressing for children. So on the back of that, quite a few of the nurseries who were involved moved their nurseries to be less busy, and to really think about what that nursery felt like if you were sort of 50 centimetres tall as opposed to perhaps 2 metres tall, and looking at, I guess, looking at an environment from the perspective as a small child rather than an adult, and actually what's needed. There was also a move away from sort of plastic and quite hard textures to things that were textures that were a bit more varied and also more natural, so that seemed to reduce sort of concerns about overstimulation. The second point I think is fairly obvious, that what works for one child isn't necessarily going to work for other children. So knowing your children and the language barriers that each child have being different. So I guess there's something about scripted conversations and interventions don't necessarily work for everybody. So how do you make things both bespoke and manageable? And I'll come on to something that we did linked to that. And then the third, I think, really key theme that came out of it is really thinking and being really intentional about the language that you use in an early years setting, and not kind of sort of filling the space with an awful lot of words, but thinking about how you do that in a way that's enjoyable for children. So almost reducing the amount of words that you're using, but actually making them more intentional and careful. And with that, we've talked a bit about using consistent use of visuals to support children, signs and gestures. So those children who have no language at all and are just beginning on their language journey have a sort of hook to get them on the way. And then I guess this links to what the other speakers were saying, that idea of structure and predictability is doing things over and over and over again, so that children start to see it in lots and lots of different contexts. So this is language that we use. Maybe it's not just outside. Oh, it's not just with this book. Oh, it's not just with this resource. And it becomes more generalized rather than being specific to a different area or adult. And then finally, the emotional learning, which was something that was then picked up and I spoke about previously, that idea of giving children emotional vocabulary that they can use to express themselves, and became very, very important for all of our nursery settings. And perhaps if I tell you a little bit then, and there is a free publication that you can see there that you can download if you're interested, and look at the piece of research that we did with UCL and the Laurel Trust. So we talked, one of the pieces of research that we did for children with autism that I think would be really interesting for children generally with a language barrier is how to teach expressive language as opposed to sort of language that sort of gets them what they need and sort of has their needs met, sort of really developing expressive language for description and for allowing them to be more socially integrated. So for here, we used a sort of game setting and that idea of a child working alongside a child with really strong language in a really small, regular intervention each day. The interesting thing, and perhaps the comparison with Nellie, is that they weren't scripted conversations, but they did use consistent resources and boards. And that idea of children practicing a language skill, maybe it's words or a sentence or a particular type of language unit, and then getting something for their board to make up a picture that met with their needs. So if the child was interested in trains or in a particular, I don't know, cartoon character, that they'd get a piece for their board as they practice the language. And they'd practice the language by asking for the piece, and those pieces would create a board that gave them, I guess, joy, because it was something they enjoyed. And that small intervention was hugely successful with the small group of children that we did it with. It's perhaps something that we need to think about scaling up to see if it works for more children, but really sort of fascinating. So I guess that sort of brings me to sort of finishing off and thinking about how you pull all of these things together. And my reflection so far as a practitioner is that I think there's a lot of really good practice happening in our nurseries already, but often we don't know why it's good. And the ability to refine and review only really comes when you understand why things are successful or not, which is, why that understanding of the research and the evidence base is so crucial, because it allows you to change and make decisions. I guess my question for the rest of the speakers in terms of thinking about moving forwards is, I was reflecting on that idea of birth weight and the Marmot Review and thinking, gosh, we don't know enough about that. And I suppose in the development of children and language learning, is that the piece that's missing. So I'll leave it there, but there's honestly so much to think about, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions for us.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Cassie. And can you all hear me? Yeah. That was a very diverse range of issues that we've raised, and there's a very large amount of interconnectedness as well over some of the issues that have been brought up. And then the contexts have been different as well. So I think that we have some questions in the question box, and maybe I'll start with the one with Jean, or maybe with this is an interesting one. Cassie, seeing as you've just finished, someone asks about the fascinating work on supporting the children with autism. Did you take lessons from this for supporting other children? Great that you're going to scale up. So what have you learned from supporting autistic children in supporting other children?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that I think people have said in terms of other research. We've learned that children are unpredictable, and therefore the scripting of conversations, even for children who are quite fixed in their sort of interests, was really quite limiting. So not scripting conversations. The importance of building interventions around a child's interest in sustaining their engagement, and for us also the importance of giving children role models, so scaffolds of other children. So actually seeing the benefit of having children with strong language and perhaps weaker language working together, rather than separating those two things out. I'd say the key things.
That's really interesting and helpful. Jean, you talked about a number of the initiatives that have been come on board, and some of them are terrific and they support home learning and regional learning and so on. What about the fact that government have recognised these research imperatives, but then at the same time they're closing children's centres and not funding nursery schools? Do you think that there'll be any negative impact from policies being rebalanced that way?
There's always a tension, isn't there? Austerity goes against a lot of other policies that we'd all like to see happen, and we worry, all of us, about more austerity to come, don't we? So I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I do know that there's a bit of policy that's coming up that I think will be helpful. It came from a new announcement that government want to strengthen family hubs, which are children's centres are often called family hubs. So government want to strengthen those. So there is a commitment there. But the problem will be local authority funding, and local authorities here today, and they are really stretched, and often their budgets are huge. We know some are going bankrupt. We know special needs budgets are overstretched. So I wouldn't minimise the difficulties in local areas. But I think the policy is, we want children's centres stroke family hubs, and there's also a policy that every local area is going to be asked to develop a Start for Life strategy about the first 1001 days of life, the first 2 years of life, where early language really important. So that could be helpful too.
So a lot of this is predicated on the Andrea Leadsom review.
Yes, that's the one. Yes,
I mean, it seems to me that a lot of recent government policy under austerity has been to move things into the responsibility of homes and families rather than public sector, particularly expensive, high quality public sector provision like children's centres and nursery schools. I think we welcome focus on parents and families and getting what they need. But given that the research shows that dealing with families without some kind of centre-based provision is harder to reach, more expensive and less effective, it does beg some questions about the balance that we need to create for these things. There's a question about how do we identify, measure high quality preschool environments? And then one directly to me about why the ECA-Z scores didn't predict oral language. I expected that one to come up. I'll start with that, and then maybe Sandra, you could come in because you're very expert on measuring quality as well. Well, I'll take those two together because, you know, the way we measured high quality in epi-and-EPSI was through environmental rating scales. And one of the things I learned through doing that was environment alone couldn't compensate for pedagogy, and the pedagogical aspect needed to be stronger in scales. Moving directly to speak about why ECA-Z scores didn't predict oral language is because the 4 subscales we've got, the one on language is called literacy, and it looks at print in the environment, books and literacy area, adults reading to children, sounds and words, emergent writing, mark making, and only one of the items is talking and listening. Hence, you would expect that the scale would pick up more on early literacy and the quality of early literacy, and therefore be linked to emergent literacy than to oracy. I also think there are measurement issues. I think it's harder to show and measure change in oral language. And because our measure focused more on emergent literacy, that's what it showed. Our reaction, well, my reaction to that, because I was the one that led on the studies of more effective centres through doing mixed method qualitative studies of them, we picked up that there were high levels of process quality around interactions with very skilled teachers in those more effective centres. And the STEW scale was built on the quality that we picked up on that process quality and is a much more pedagogical scale. And it's a derivative of the research coming from great practitioners, as it were. And this is where I think the iterative relationship in studying practice in a mixed method way allows you to go back and forth and look at the links between practice and measurement. So I think if we had used the STEW then, which wasn't developed, it's come out of EPSI, I think that probably would have picked up on oracy more. That's my hunch. But then I also defer to the fact that it is harder to measure. I know that when we use STEW and ECA-Z in other studies in New South Wales and Victoria, in Australia, and in the SEED study, maybe slightly less so, it has picked up on both maths and aspects of language. Not necessarily vocabulary, but aspects of language, like expressive language. And that's because it's slightly more aimed at looking at that quality. Sandra, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just really, Iram, to echo what you're saying. I think, you know, the richness, it's a bit like language richness, I suppose, when you're measuring something, you know, and you're focusing on a particular domain like oral language, then you have to make sure that your tools, either for measuring or for developing, are rich in the domain that you want to focus on. And, you know, there are a lot of tools which are very, very broad, useful for research because they cover lots of different aspects of practice, but actually to really look at and develop a specific area, they are quite shallow in all areas. And actually to really move forward your thinking and your understanding in relation to support for oral language, you need a tool that does that really deeply and well. You know, so tools like the STEW, there are tools that are specific for oral language development. So I think that's really important. You know, it's the same for professional development. All the evidence says trying to do too many things at once just isn't useful. You need to identify the area that you're looking at and really focus on that deeply. And I think I was fascinated. I'd love to hear more, Cassie, about some of the work that you're doing with your team there. Around instructional coaching and developing practice, because I think for me, you know, the measurement is only the first step, right? Actually, these tools can be really used very positively, I think, to develop a culture of professional development and professional reflection, using them in that really analytical way. And they can be used to develop the kinds of analytical knowledge that I was talking about before, you know, that you're observing each other, you're analysing that, you're discussing, you're thinking deeply, you're rehearsing, you're practicing, because it's only really through that very deep focus, the analysing and then the practicing the new skills. That's in answer to Jean's last question. You know, that's one of the ways that we achieve change, because actually change is hard, you know, and we really need to think deeply, give it space, and then practice that new knowledge and those skills in context, really to make a shift in our practice. So I think tools like that can be really useful in that context.
Okay. I just want to say one other thing. We've got all the reports now published from the International Early Learning Study, and I think it's fascinating how teachers' concerns around educating the whole child have come out in preeminence out of that study, because it is showing that all aspects of learning are linked, that where children do well social emotionally, it's linked to literacy, numeracy, oracy, and even things like trust and empathy. Even physical development is linked to those things. And if children are behind in their physical development, they tend to be behind on other things as well. And similarly, we tend to think of language as being the core aspect, and it is very important. But I also think, listening to Cassie about how she was linking language with the rule of work, the self-regulation, the ability to engage in tasks, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that language is very important, but that it is linked to all other areas of development. Rachel Takriti asked the question about, do you see a lower than expected? I think that's supposed to be HLE, home learning environment. I might be wrong. In busy families, even though they may have higher household incomes, or maybe it's their higher education, not quite sure. I'm assuming it's HLE. Yes, we did see that. We saw that in some families. There were, as I said, there was a modest association in terms of effect sizes with middle class families and higher HLE, but we did find some high economically and educationally high families which were not giving their children a high HLE, and actually that was reflected in their cognitive scores when they came. Jean, a question for you from Sandra. Maybe Sandra can ask it herself.
Oh, yeah, I can. Jean, I was interested, just following up on my interest, I guess, in the, I hope this is the right question, in the digital space and technology. I just wondered if you might say something about what government is doing in that space, or might be doing.
this links with another question that, am I mute now? A participant asked about strategies for technology use for language learning, so bring those in. I'm not an expert on this. The National Literacy Trust would be. The government have funded apps in relation to the teaching of early reading, through a formal process of criteria. I'm not aware that they're developing that for spoken language. It's really interesting that the BBC, many of you will know that actually the biggest campaign about early language at the moment is not Hungry Little Minds. It is the nationwide BBC Tiny Happy People, where they've produced a whole lot of digital content for families. And the person in charge of that has told me that apps are not the way forward, that this is not the way to communicate with families. I thought it was the be all and end all, but she says not. Facebook better, and TikTok and Instagram the way. So interesting. The government has funded some apps. They funded Easy Peasy, the app which teaches both parents to promote both self-regulation and other cognitive things, including language. So it was originally designed for self-regulation. So that has had funding and has worked in a number of areas. They've worked with ICANN to roll that out through government funding. But, I'm just reminded of the research I read. That was an amazing piece of research where they tried to get children to learn some new words through their parents. And one group of parents had an all singing, all dancing set of videos to teach those words, a bit like Sesame Street, and they played them over and over with the children. The other families were just given the list of words and says, use these words as you interact with your children in the course of the day. Now, guess which group remembered the words more. I'm certainly not being anti-digital, but sometimes we may go too far in the effort to be digital, where we should just focus on being more human, especially having spent all day on Zoom today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we do miss something in the audience, because if we had done this live, we have such a distinguished audience. They would have hopefully contributed to the discussion, because some of them know more than we do about some of the topics that are being raised. I just wanted to, in some ways, the question about why does vocabulary matter so much is very important, because it's an indicator for something. I don't think it's sufficient in its own, philosophically speaking. Vocabulary is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. It's what it's a proxy for. I mean, Catherine Snow said to me that it's a proxy not just for a word gap, it's a proxy for knowledge of the world gap. And I would go even one step further and say that it's a proxy for a gap in social and cultural capital. Now, I remember very early on when we started the EPSI study, this is going back to 1996-97, Tony Blair made a very interesting comment. Yes, he did make some interesting comments, which was about there were two kinds of poverty that we were facing when he was talking about education. One was the material poverty that we can all relate to, and the other one was a poverty of aspiration and social and cultural capital, which is harder, in my view, to compensate for later. This needs to come much earlier, and words give children that, but it's not just the words, it's the experiences that they have. And Cassie's point about getting children in pairs to do things is an excellent way, I think, of getting children to share some of that capital that they have. I'm going to see if there's any other questions. People have used this scale, found it useful, very nice. Okay, there's an interesting question by Beatrice Merrick on what do the panel think should be the priority for government right now on this issue, given the pressure on resources. Jean, do you want to start with that one?
I think it is, it's two. It's as we talked about earlier, children's centres. We need that workforce there to particularly work with under twos and their families, who are mostly not in settings. It's great when they are, and great in Cassie's provision, for example. I think that's fantastic, but even earlier than that. So children's centres, and that is local government funding. I mean, the government have set up an expert group to support children's centres, family hubs, and advise them, but they need to be there in the first place. And the second would be, and I'm sure everybody here will say that, is sustained funded training for the early years workforce.
Cassie.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jean on this. It's something we were talking about as a school, kind of thinking, what's our 5-year plan? And what we've written down, if I only could show you my notebook, is what's happening between sort of birth and 2. And we're almost getting these children too late. And if you sort of take, you know, the Marmot review and this idea of your best start, 2 feels too late, and supporting families with, I guess that was in my question about low birth weight, because low birth weight to me in itself is that would seem indicative of something else, a health inequality. So how are we working, and who are, I know that Reach Feltham are doing some work on this. So who are the people who are leading the way and actually getting out there in the community, schools, nurseries, other settings, to support families before 2, so that they're on doing the right things. And it links back to all of the conversation you had before about apps. And you know, what we learned is that actually what we needed to do with our families during that wider closure period, where some families but not many had their children at home in early years, was try and be a bit more sort of invitational and low stakes, and take the pressure off families, which I think is what the BBC campaign does very well, is not make parents feel bad about the time that they have, but just how you use that time well. And that comes through in that the Royal Foundation report, doesn't it, about kind of building up parents' confidence to do the right thing, rather than spending sort of time stressing that they don't have this app or that app, or this book or that book. Yeah, I would agree. Before 2, more before 2. Maybe that's the policy name. Yeah.
But that fits with what Jean has said about the first 1,000 and so many days as well. I think with the pandemic, boundaries have got confused in terms of what parents do at home, because there's been quite a lot that's been coming from nurseries and primary schools about what parents should do at home. And many parents, I think, certainly our children and grandchildren, the parents have struggled with being more of a pedagogue than a HLE support. And I think some distinction now, after what you said, Cassie, in support of parents as to what they can do in terms of usual home routines, you know, meal times, bath time, all those, reading the book to your child, compared to worksheets or, you know, other kinds of things that have been demanded by sometimes by parents themselves. But I think there is a challenge where the boundaries have been blurred, and it would be really helpful if schools actually lead the way and help parents to kind of go back into that parenting role with a strong home learning environment rather than home education, as it were.
Can I just add something else there, just a thought that links in with a previous question, because I absolutely agree. I think it's about, you know, giving families the permission to have fun with their children again, right? And to really enjoy that, and that is the space where the language will happen, you know, that quality rather than quantity, if you like. And linking back into the question you referenced, Jean, I was just thinking about then the role of technology and, you know, all of those things. Actually, there are some really great apps that are coming out that encourage parent-child interaction in the real world. So, you know, there's one, I think, developed by the Bradford Nursery Schools, 50 Things to Do Before You're 5, which I love. And that's just lots of ideas, all free, you know, blowing bubbles or going to your local park, but it's embedded within the local environment. So the Bradford one's in Bradford, and then if it's somewhere else, it's translated so it features, you know, local areas, and, you know, some really just nice, simple ways. And that, I think, is, you know, where we should be going is helping parents again to first take the pressure off, but then really to be able to have fun and conversations that are enjoyable with children instead of feeling like absolutely they've got to work through a ton of worksheets. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Could I just say something about health inequalities that's been on my mind in response to Cassie? So it was the low birth weight thing is fascinating, isn't it? It contributes to later language outcomes, but also early language itself, after controlling for things like low birth weight, predict later health inequalities. That was what Marmot was partly about. And in policy terms, I spend a lot of time trying to convince the health service that if they invest in this area, it will reduce. I mean, there's some research that shows that language at age 3 is one of a key basket of indicators that predicts how, as adults, how many hospitalizations and prescriptions people will need, the cost of that. But the other key message is about people working together. I know here today we have people from diverse professions. And what I've learned is that, so for example, if a practitioner in an early years setting or a childminder knows that low birth weight matters for their outcomes, their accountabilities, say about children's communication language, anything they do to encourage parents not to smoke when pregnant or to work with midwives on low birth weight will help them with their outcomes. So it's all about realizing how we contribute to each other's outcomes. And that's why these early years systems, where early years settings work with health visitors and with speech language therapists, get the best outcomes.
The birth weight issue is a little bit more complicated because in EPSI we looked at very low birth weight, and that's what we're comparing with. And this is children under 1,500 grams. Children who are low birth weight, that's between 1,500 and 2,500 grams, did catch up by the age of about 11. But as younger children could often have delayed language, maybe be a bit more fretful. It's not to label children, it's to look out for what their needs are. A child who's had less gestation time, because many of these children are also premature, but they can also be very low birth weight. The issues are higher in some ethnic groups than others. For instance, Black Caribbean mothers have a disproportionate number of low birth weight children. And it's these things are beyond what we can do, but we can certainly make educationalists and parents aware that there's the possibility, because these factors are confounding. If you've got lots of resources and support and a very high HLE and the protective factors are all there, it might make less difference. But even so, being aware of those things, I think, is very important. But it's also important not to put a deficit model down for those children, because same as summer born, there are many, I've had many researchers that were both low birth weight and summer born and absolutely fantastic. So we have to be a little bit careful, but as people who work with young children, it's also important to be aware of it. Sandra, there's a question here from Louisa who says, don't you need all of these to be in place, meaning interventions, universal, including CPD, targeted for children who need it, and specialist support for children with complex needs?
Yes, my answer to that is yes, absolutely. So I think, yes, you really need a rich toolkit, I suppose, of approaches. In a way, I suppose that was really my point, is to say that, yes, use targeted approaches, but also make sure that you have universal. Yes, use scripted programs because they are also useful and, can be implemented very consistently, but not only scripted programs. Make sure that you're investing in the professional development as well. So I think really those questions are designed in exactly the way that you are suggesting, to be making sure that we don't have any gaps, that we don't rely just on one particular route, because we happen to be offered it or because it happens to be more straightforward. So actually we need to be thinking about the broad balance of all of the different ways that we're meeting children's needs for oral language. So yeah, couldn't agree with more with that point, I think.
Okay, I think that I'm going to bring the session to a close by asking Cassie, Sandra and Jean if there are any comments they want to make related to their talk or anyone else's. Our paper will be informed by your questions in the audience. If you have work that we haven't cited that you think is particularly important related to practice, policy or research, please pass it on to us. You can pass it on through Bira if you like, or directly to one of us. We do talk to each other and we will share it. Or if there are particular issues you think we have neglected in our paper, we'd love to hear from you. We can't promise that we can cover everything in the length that we've got, but we do like a challenge. So, Cassie, do you have any last minute comments?
Yeah, I've always got comments. I think I just sort of want to reflect on the power of a couple of things. The one, the kind of interconnectedness of all of this. It's easy to sort of land on a solution, and maybe that's what people feel the Nelly intervention is, that it's the solution. But listening to you all speak, you know, that idea of the health, relationships with families, the quality of the early setting, there's so much that goes on for a small child. But I guess it's want to reassure the practitioners in the audience that you can't do everything, and that some things are indeed out of your control, and what you can do is your best version of you, I guess, of the factors that are within your control. And engaging in research to me seems like a really good place to start. Yeah.
Sandra?
Yes, I suppose really just to say how important, I think, how enjoyable it's been really to be discussing the importance of oral language. I only wish that we could be discussing it live with the audience. That would really have added an extra dimension. It's ever more important at the moment. I mean, if ever there was a time for all of the hard work that you're all doing out there around oral language, it's now, you know, so great time to be thinking about it. Really important time to be an early years practitioner. And I guess just the last comment, I've been thinking about it throughout really, but just to make the link with something that Cassie was talking about, which is the social and emotional development, and you know how important it is that we look at that alongside the oral language. And you know, there's data coming out now around maybe where children have delay in their oral language, but actually the impact of COVID has been, you know, very significantly on children's social and emotional development. And actually we need to be really thinking about meeting those needs together and alongside, and in a way that's really interlinked. So I think that's my final thought.
Jean?
One would be just reflecting on what Sandra says. I think it'd be great if we all shared and got messages out about how social emotional development and language development are, to me, two sides of the same coin. If you watch a sensitive, attuned parent interacting with their baby, you see both, don't you? You see both the attachment and well-being promoted alongside that contingency that we know supports language development. So we shouldn't think of PSED and CNL as quite separate things. One predicts the other, and they're interlinked. And the second, I just want to reflect on how wonderful children and babies are, and answer the last question that popped up when I looked at the questions. A colleague asked, is there strengths-based research that recognises the embodied communication strategies that children bring to learning language? For example, gaze, gesture, hand movements, active communicators. And yes, we really should recognise that. The brilliant research group Lucid have done a whole lot of work on early gesture, and they're continuing to do this, gaze and gesture. But children are born communicators. They have this inbuilt system that primes them. All we need to do is make sure that we put the right input in, but they are active learners and they reach out for us to build their communication skills. And we should never forget their role. They're not passive, they're very active.
Thank you very much. And I would just add that another area that's been identified under COVID is physical development. Children who have not had the kind of energetic play and freedom to engage with people, you know, whether they're on a walk and see someone's dog and have a chat with them about it, or whether it's play with friends and social talk. The physicality is connected. As part of the IEL study, the OECD one, in England, NFER and myself produced a physical development secondary measure, and that is strongly associated with language, social emotional and math skills. So one thing we're learning is that young children's development is interconnected. And just like you can't separate the social emotional and the linguistic, I think it's about time we looked at some other aspects of development too. And my last point would be that I wish we would learn more from the different countries in the UK, because there is some terrific work going on under Flying Start in Wales and in the early years foundation phase, and also in Scotland in the curriculum 3 to 6, and the work they're doing with under 3s, particularly around the home learning environment and the kind of resources that they're putting out to practitioners. And we can also learn of things that we don't want to do from each other because of trial and error in the different countries. So I just basically want to thank everybody. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you to our many distinguished guests from the United Arab Emirates, from Singapore, from Malaysia, Australia, and from London and far-flung places like that. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Bira again for hosting this. I understand that it's been recorded and that Bira members will be able to access it. If you would like any of our emails, because you want to ask us a question directly, please email the organisers, and I'm sure it will be fine for you to have our email and for us to correspond with you, because I can see many more questions in the chat that we haven't been able to address. And just thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. Have a great weekend when it finally comes.